What's up guys? Welcome back. For today's video, I'm going to be taking you through my process for repotting several different types of carnivorous plants. Let's get to it. To start off, this is an overview of my transplanting station for today. In the back, we have the 5 plants sitting in front of the pots into which they will be transplanted. And then going from the left to the right, we have the 3 different types of media that I'm going to be using, some powder-free gloves to keep my hands free from any infections and to help prevent them from drying up due to washing and being wiped with alcohol, a black Tupperware into which I will be dumping the old media, some isopropyl alcohol, which is what's in the red spray bottle, another spray bottle of fresh water, a pair of fine-tipped scissors, and a pair of needle-nose tweezers. To start, I'm going to just dump out the water that's in the pitchers so it doesn't make a mess. And then while carefully holding the plant so that everything doesn't just fall out and get smashed, I'm going to gently squeeze the sides of the pot to help the media break away from the walls so that the roots and as much media as possible can all come out in one shot, doing as little damage to the root mass as possible. At this point, I begin picking off the top layer of moss, which at this point was mostly star moss instead of live sphagnum moss, because it's been a while and the star moss is pretty persistent and managed to almost completely take over. And on top of being unsightly, it also forms a pretty dense layer of roots, which I find can inhibit the growth of certain kinds of carnivorous plants. And while it didn't seem to be bothering this Cephalotus very much, it does seem to spread from plant to plant pretty easily, so when I can get rid of it, I do. I also always rather have live sphagnum moss growing than star moss. It just looks so much nicer. Now you may see me being a little bit rough to the root area of this plant, but that's only because I'm trying to pick out some Utricularia reniformis that has been growing in here as well, which hitchhiked its way in through some live sphagnum moss, which I used to top it the last time. And while it didn't seem to be bothering this particular plant, Utricularia reniformis does have very robust stolons, so I didn't want to take the risk of it getting out of control before I get to repot it again. But if you're not dealing with something like that, I recommend leaving the root area as untouched as possible, especially on a plant like Cephalotus, which is known to be a bit sensitive in that regard. This is also the point where I'll remove any dead pitchers, which I may find stuck between the others, just so I can avoid any problems with decay over time. As you can see, this process is a little bit tedious, but the plant is fragile, so be sure to not rush, because if you do, you'll likely end up breaking something that you wish you didn't. And remember, the tweezers are your best friend here, because if you shove your fingers in between the pitchers or the rhizomes, sometimes you'll pry them apart too far and things will snap. So just remember, take it slow and be as gentle as possible. Now I was planning on using this little clay colored pot right here, but since the plant ended up looking a little bit bigger than I expected once I opened up the pitchers a little bit and made them a little bit less cramped, I decided to go get another one of these bigger black pots instead. So I just dumped the media in there, and that's where I'll be repotting it. For this one, I opted to use pure long fibered sphagnum moss. Now, you can use perlite, and sometimes I do, to add a little bit of aeration ability to the media, but since I haven't really noticed any difference between when I do and when I don't, this time, since I didn't have any on hand, I just went ahead and used the straight long fiber sphagnum moss. The way I generally like to do this is to put some of whatever media I'm going to be using into the bottom of the pot with a dent in the middle and some of the new media going up the side of the walls of the pot so that the original root ball can fit in nicely. And then I'll put the plant back into the pot to see if I need to make any adjustments to the media level before moving on to the next step. This is the same process that I use whenever I pot something up using long fibered sphagnum moss or live sphagnum moss, so you'll see me do the same with the Nepenthes and the Heliamphora in just a little bit. Once I'm done with that, I'll put the plant back into the pot and begin to use some more media to fill in the rest of the empty space between the pot and the roots. Sometimes at this point I will push the plant down a little further into the media if I feel like I potted it a little bit too high up. But again, if you do this, be very careful because you can snap things, and I have. So in all honesty, you may be better off just taking it out and restarting from the last step. It's up to you. At this point, you have the option of either leaving the plant as is and moving on, or top dressing with live sphagnum moss if you opted to use long fibered versus live sphagnum moss as the base media itself. Personally, whenever I use long fibered sphagnum moss, I like to top dress with live moss because it helps me avoid issues with slime and star moss, at least for a lot longer than when I don't use it. And honestly, it just ends up looking a lot nicer in my opinion, especially once it starts to grow in and the entire top is full of moss heads all facing upward and filling in the empty spaces between the pitchers and leaves. I tend to use about a half an inch layer of live sphagnum moss when I top my Cephalotus plants, but you can go deeper than that if you like. If you have enough moss, you could even fill the entire pot and just use pure live sphagnum moss instead of dried long fiber sphagnum moss. But since not everyone has a ton of it and you might want to save a little bit, I find the long fiber sphagnum moss to work just fine, and then the top dressing with the live stuff just pulls it all together a little bit more nicely. Another media option you have with Cephalotus is peat moss, silica sand, and perlite. When I use this kind of mix, I like to keep it very airy with a lot of sand and a lot of perlite so that the water drains right through it and it doesn't just form a dense block of media around the roots. And I also like to keep the perlite content down to the bottom 3/4 of the pot so that when I top water my plants, which is the way I tend to water these, all the perlite doesn't just float to the top and make an ugly mess. I will say that on the plant that I have growing in open air in this media, I have top dressed it with live sphagnum moss because I just like the way it looks. But that doesn't appear to be necessary because I didn't always have it that way and it grew just fine. Now, something interesting to note is that in my closed planted terrarium, the Cephalotus I had growing in long fibered sphagnum moss actually didn't do very well. And when I put them in a well drained peat mix, they started to do much better. So environmental conditions may play somewhat of a significant role in which media mix works better for you. So if you're not having success with one of them, feel free to try the other and to see if it works better. Personally though, I grow most of my Cephalotus out on an open air shelf, and I find that long fibered sphagnum moss and live sphagnum moss are my two favorites, so those are the ones I usually go with. Now what you're seeing me do here is spraying the plant with some pure water, and this does two things. One, it cleans up the pitchers a little bit so it looks nice, and two, it knocks any bits of floating media down into place so that they can stay moist and not just dry up and blow away. I'll also be giving the plant a thorough top watering when I put it back onto my shelf so that all the media makes good contact with the roots, and then I'll spray some water into all the pitchers so that they don't wilt and dehydrate, because once they do, they tend to not recover very well, and Cephalotus pitchers take a long time to grow, so I prefer to keep the ones that I already have going looking as healthy as possible for as long as possible. Alright, so the second plant I'm going to be working with here is Nepenthes ventricosa. Now, as you can see, just like with the Cephalotus, it has a lot of this unsightly moss, as well as some Utricularia reniformis, which got in the same way through the live sphagnum top dressing. So I'm going to be peeling that all off and cleaning up these dead pitchers and leaves as well, and then putting it into some fresh media and a larger pot so it can get a little bit bigger. As you can see here, the bottom of the pot is a little bit slimy and mossy as well, so I'm going to be checking the bottom of the media to make sure that it's not decomposing, because that can cause some problems for your plants too. Now notice how I used the same method of removing the plant from the pot that I did with the Cephalotus. Basically, just gently hold the plant and then squeeze the side of the pot so the media comes loose, and then the whole thing should come out in one shot. Right here you can see one of those Utricularia reniformis stolons, and you can see how thick they are, so I'm going to go in and try to remove as much of that as possible. Now, even though I am removing quite a bit of the media that's around the roots, I am still trying to avoid snapping them to the best of my ability to avoid putting too much stress on the plant. At this point, I'm bringing in the scissors to remove any fully dead leaves and dying pitchers. You want to be very careful because one wrong move and you can end up cutting off something that's perfectly healthy and possibly set your plant back several months or even years. As you can see here, I just made one of those mistakes and I ended up cutting off a perfectly healthy pitcher. Luckily, this species is pretty hardy and readily grows new pitchers, so it shouldn't be too much of a big deal. But if it were a slower grower, a rarer plant, or if I had actually cut one of the main vines, that could have been a much bigger problem. So remember, be careful and take it slow. As you can see here, the plant has 2 growth points, but they don't each have their own roots, so I decided not to split them apart. You can root Nepenthes vine cuttings, but I actually like the way this plant looks this way, so I decided to put the whole thing into one pot. From here on out, the potting process is pretty much exactly the same as it was with the Cephalotus, where I fill the pot with the base media, which in this case was again long fibered sphagnum moss, put the plant inside, fill the rest of the open space around the roots with more of the media, and then top with some live sphagnum moss. Right there you can see I sprayed my hands with some of the rubbing alcohol and then let them air dry because the plant had some slime and star moss spores on it, and I didn't want to take the chance of letting either of those two things contaminate the live sphagnum moss that I'm using for top dressing. Here you see me spray my hands with some of the fresh water and check the smell before spraying my plant, because even though I have 2 different colored bottles, sometimes when you're a bit distracted you might grab the wrong one, and you definitely don't want to spray the entire top of your plant with isopropyl alcohol. Generally, it's a much better idea to make sure that you label each bottle and double check before every use. Again, I'm using the spray to knock the media into place and to clean the top of the plant, and then also to fill the pitchers so that they don't wilt. And there you have it, nice and fresh. Next up on the list is this Venus flytrap. The media in this pot has gotten quite slimy, and a lot of the new traps that are coming in have been turning black before they even get to fully mature, so I decided that this one needed to be repotted ASAP. Again, you can see that the way that I unpot my Venus flytraps is identical to the way that I did the other 2 plants, and I actually find it a bit easier with these because their root systems aren't as extensive, which makes it a bit easier to peel the media away without doing any significant damage. Also, ironically, even though the top layer of media getting covered in slime or moss is not really a good thing, it does seem to make the unpotting process a bit easier because the whole top chunk of the media tends to come out in one piece without falling apart and making a mess, and it also breaks away from the rhizome in big chunks. Now I'm going to grab the scissors to trim off any of the dead or dying leaves and the traps that died before they matured, but before I do that, the same way I cleaned my hands with the alcohol before, I'm going to clean these scissors as well, because I used them on the Nepenthes that had slime and star moss spores on it, and I don't want to transfer those into this new fresh media. At this point, I take the fresh water bottle again and spray off any of the old slimy media and bits of moss that were stuck in between the leaves and around the rhizome on this plant. With Venus flytraps, a lot of people worry about the traps closing during repotting, and honestly, while it does stress the plant a little bit, in my experience, it's never stressed them enough to kill them, and they tend to bounce back pretty quickly. That said, if your plant is already pretty stressed out, you may want to be a little bit more careful with not triggering as many traps as possible, because if you can avoid adding excess stress to a plant, that's usually the better option. Now, something to note is that in my experience, possibly because I am a little bit rough with these plants, the traps that are on the plant during the repotting process don't tend to fully recover and sometimes lose their ability to close again after they reopen, if they do. But within several weeks, my plants tend to have a bunch of new traps coming out, and they usually look much healthier than they did before being repotted. For Venus flytraps, I like to use a sandy peat perlite mix, but since I said before I don't have perlite, I'm opting to just go with a very sandy peat mix this time. Again, like what I mentioned during the Cephalotus repotting, if I do use perlite, I like to keep it to the bottom 3/4 of the pot, so if I top water the plant or spray it down to clean it, perlite doesn't just float to the top and make the whole thing look pretty ugly. Because Venus flytraps don't have very extensive root systems, unlike the 2 previous plants, I like to just fill the entire pot with media, poke a hole in the middle of it afterwards, and then just stick the plant right in there. Once you put the plant in the hole, be sure to gently push the media around it, adding a little bit more if needed to fill in the extra spaces that you may create, so that the entire root system has good contact with the media. Then give it a bit of a gentle spray with pure water to again help the media make contact with the roots and to clean up the traps so it looks nice, and you're good to go. If you spray the traps, this may close them, so if you've managed to somehow avoid closing all of your traps during this process and don't want to add any extra stress to the plant, you may want to skip this step. But like I said before, I tend to be a little bit rough with these, so most of the traps on my Venus flytraps are already closed at this point, and even if they aren't, I have yet to kill a plant by closing any of its traps during repotting, so I usually do it. It's up to you though. Lastly, at this point, you're going to want to make sure that you label your plant, because unless it's a typical Venus flytrap, it can get very confusing remembering which one is which, and if you forget the ID on your plant, that can be a bit of a problem because you really don't want to be guessing and confusing things, especially if you're going to be trading or selling. This one in particular is actually a seed-grown plant from a selfed werewolf clone. And I really like this one because when it gets a bit bigger, it tends to grow all of its traps almost completely upright, unlike some of the others from the same batch of seeds. The fourth plant that I'm going to be working with today is this Heliamphora. As you can see, it has multiple growth points, so this one should be fun. The first thing I'm going to do is clean up the tag, and then we'll get to the real work. By now, you guys should be familiar with my unpotting process, but one thing to note with Heliamphora is that the pitchers are extremely brittle, so you have to be very, very careful while holding them, and even a little bit of pressure in the wrong spot can snap a pitcher or even an entire growth point. As you can see right here, I just gave a good example of that and snapped this growth point, unfortunately above the area where it was connected to the roots, but I'm just going to remove that and put it on the side and plant it in the pot anyway, because it may root. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. This one I don't have much hope for, but instead of throwing it out, I'm going to give it a shot. Again, what I'm focusing on here is removing as much of the slimy sphagnum moss as possible, the stuff that got covered in algae over time, and also getting rid of as much star moss as possible. I also clean up as many dead pitchers as I can to help prevent rot and to just make it all look nicer. At this point, I realized that there were two clear growth points that each had their own root sections, so I decided to gently pry those apart. And even though I can plant them in two separate pots at this point, I have multiples of this plant already, so I'm going to put them all back into the same pot and just space them out a little bit more nicely. When trimming these, you can sometimes pull off a dead pitcher with your fingers, as you will see me do here, but I recommend using the scissors as much as possible because sometimes in prying off a pitcher, you'll end up snapping an entire growth point, so make sure you're very careful with that. As far as media goes, ideally I like to use pure live sphagnum moss, but since I don't have that much of it right now, I'm going to use my second favorite option, which is long fibered sphagnum moss, and then just top it with the live stuff like I did with the Cephalotus and the Heliamphora before. I've noticed great results both ways. You can also mix in some perlite with this, but I haven't found it to be necessary. I pot these up the same way that I pot up my Cephalotus and Nepenthes, but as I've mentioned a few times in this Heliamphora segment, Heliamphora are very brittle, so you're going to have to be extremely careful and very gentle with them. You might remember earlier when I was potting up the Cephalotus that I pushed it down a little bit into the media so that it would fit better into the pot. With Heliamphora, you definitely don't want to do that. You'll probably end up snapping some of the pitchers if you don't end up snapping the entire growth point off of the roots altogether. As I'm sure you can tell by now, when dealing with Heliamphora, one of the biggest themes is being as careful as possible. They're one of the most structurally fragile carnivorous plants, so always be careful, take your time, and be very gentle because otherwise you'll end up regretting it. Something to note here, especially while doing your top dressing, is that you don't want to leave the growth points sticking up high out of the media because you don't want them to dry out. The last plant that I'm going to be repotting today is this beautiful Sarracenia rosea, which I picked up at the ICPS 2018 conference in California a few years ago. It's been growing in this small solo cup this entire time, so I'm excited to see how much size it puts on once it gets a bit of a pot upgrade. These pitchers tend to hold quite a bit of liquid, so I'm going to pour that out before I proceed with the rest of the unpotting process so that I don't make an absolute mess. This process is pretty much the same as with the others, so I'm just going to speed through it here. Luckily, Sarracenia are quite a bit less fragile than Heliamphora, so I can be a little bit more relaxed. Now when potting up the Sarracenia, I use the same method that I used with the Cephalotus and the Nepenthes, except instead of using long fibered or live sphagnum moss, I use a very sandy peat mix. Basically just fill the bottom of the pot and put a little media up the side of the walls, put the plant in there, and then throw some media around the roots. If the plant is situated a little bit too high in the pot, you can push it down a little bit. Sarracenia are significantly more structurally robust than Heliamphora, so there's a bit less risk of snapping the pitchers or the growth point, but as always, exercise caution. Better safe than sorry. Something else that differs from my methods of potting up Heliamphora is that with Sarracenia, I don't cover the actual crown itself during the repotting process, but I do make sure that absolutely all of the roots are covered. You don't want them to be drying out in open air. Again, here you see me spraying it down to get any excess media off of the pitchers, and then watering it a bit from the top to make sure that all of the media is in good contact with the roots. Before we close out, I want to leave you guys with 2 more tips. If you have any springtails that you can add to your newly potted plants, now is a great time to do so. They can help mitigate any fungal growth that you may encounter. And 2, personally, when I am repotting my plants, I like to do so when they are going through a period of slow growth. So if they have a dormancy period, that's generally ideal in my opinion. And I tend to avoid repotting plants when they are either experiencing rapid growth, putting out a flower, or making a really nice new pitcher, because the extra stress from repotting may very well cause the plant to abort any of those processes, and that can set you back by about several months to a year's worth of growth. Alright guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that you're now a little bit more comfortable with repotting your carnivorous plants. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for a lot more excellent carnivorous plant content, and if you want to see more of my personal collection, my Instagram and YouTube accounts are both a bug's nightmare. Until next time, happy growing.
It's not a surprise that gardeners, educators, and scientists are fascinated by these unique plants. The International Carnivorous Plant Society, or ICPS, not only love these plants, but welcomes growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. The ICPS even started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate them. The free online event is held the first Wednesday of May. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.